Hello, I'm Maria Titizian, and welcome to EVN Talks. Joining me today in the studio is Nerses Kopalyan, and together we're going to be talking through some of the hot topics of the last several weeks: transport routes through Armenia, foreign intervention, sovereignty, etc. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Good to be here, Maria.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Can you walk us through the U.S.-backed proposal? Now, I'm trying to be very careful with the words I'm going to be using: to lease, to manage, to take over the functions. You can correct me in a minute. The 32-kilometer transit route connecting Azerbaijan, mainland Azerbaijan, to exclave Nakhichevan through Armenia. So what does this mean in practice, and how is it different from what Aliyev has been shouting and screaming about since the end of the war, about a so-called corridor, what he calls the Zangezur corridor? So let's walk everybody through this.
Of course. Sadly, so there's a lot of speculation, misinformation, innuendo floating around. And that's obviously understandable when there isn't enough information out there.
Sure.
But then, of course, regardless of how much information that there is out there, some are basically going to politicize those developments. And so you have a concerning a trend where reality is lost, and then speculation breeds conspiracy thinking, and conspiracy thinking breeds incoherence, and therefore there's all this confusion that you're referring to. What we know is as followed. The United States came and made a proposal to both sides. The Trump administration had made the decision that they are going to intervene in the South Caucasus to support the peace process.
They're going to, intervene to support the peace process.
in the South Caucasus to support the peace process. And their proposal from their lens was that the peace process cannot be achieved or ascertained if you don't have some level of normalization. And the most important issue that is basically obstructing normalization was the issue of the transit route, or what Azerbaijan has been calling the Zangezur corridor. Now, the roots of the concept, of course, comes from the so-called November 9 document that Russia and Azerbaijan basically forced down Armenia's throat. And so what was envisioned by Kremlin and Baku with respect to that corridor is very different than what the United States has offered in its proposal to both sides. Now, I can't go into the specific details of that proposal, but we could discuss what has been publicly shared.
Before you do that, Nerses, the November 9, 2020 trilateral statement said that the Russian FSB, right, would oversee the transit route.
Correct. So it's not quite clear what that constitutes.
Sure, it was a very...
But the idea of a connecting a road, link, route, whatever you want to call it, or from Azerbaijan's lands, a corridor controlled by Russian troops where Azerbaijan has unimpeded access, and this is where that whole conversation of extraterritoriality comes from, right? The November 9 statement envisioned a corridor where the Republic of Armenia has no presence. But because we are now under the understanding and the official position that the November 9 statement no longer holds because Azerbaijan and then Russia violated it, right? That is no longer applicable. But it's very important to understand where conceptually the concept of a Zangezur corridor comes from and how that is disconnected or not commensurate with what the United States is offering, right? So what the U.S. is proposing and what we've been discussing and what Armenia has said is acceptable and unacceptable is that there cannot be no foreign boots on the ground, no foreign troops or forces on the ground controlling that road, that route, that it must be under the sovereignty and jurisdiction of the Republic of Armenia. In that context, the Zangezur corridor that was envisioned is not applicable to what we're seeing being discussed out there. So those are sort of the initial underlying precepts.
Okay, but before we move forward, I think it's also important for those listeners who might not understand or know what Azerbaijan is demanding is unimpeded access. So they're saying no Armenian customs, no Armenian border guards, that so-called corridor would allow them to move freely without any Armenian, forget foreign presence. Yeah?
Absolutely. And that goes off of the November 9, their interpretation of the November 9 statement, that they will have unimpeded access through Armenia, but at the same time, they claim that because they don't trust the Armenians, there has to be some foreign oversight that is acceptable to Azerbaijan. And that was the role that the Russians were supposed to play. So in any iteration that we're looking at, right, what Azerbaijan and Russia had envisioned has nothing to do with what the United States has offered and what we have been discussing the last 2 weeks. Now, to your question, what does the U.S. proposal entail, and within the confines of what can be discussed? We know that the United States has offered a solution in which there is some mechanism of the United States coming in and through agreements with Armenia, because these are sovereign Armenian territories, either leasing those territories or in some arrangement with Armenia, developing a mechanism where which the United States becomes an actor that has a vested interest in this 32 to 34 kilometer road, okay, that serves as the basis in opening connectivity, right, and making this transit route possible. What this does from the American lens is that it addresses the underlying problem that Azerbaijan keeps bringing up, and that it has no access to Nakhichevan. So through this American proposal, you have two birds being knocked down with one stone. Armenia's goal of crossroads of peace and opening connectivity are achieved, and Azerbaijan, through this mechanism, is able to have a route connecting Azerbaijan proper to Nakhichevan. That is broadly the conceptual framework. Now, the nuances of what this lease may entail, what it would look like, the mechanisms and processes involved in making that happen, these have not been finalized, nor is there much clarity on what it would finally look like. So you're at the conceptual level. But intuitively, right, and rationally, all sides understand that if you have an American presence, whatever claims of mistrust that Azerbaijan presents to have of Armenians or Armenians controlling those roads are alleviated, because the United States, as having a presence, alleviates those concerns. And then from the Armenian side, having an American presence in Sunik, in this road, in whatever iteration, produces an important layer of a very strong yet soft power, in that it deters Azerbaijan from any potential aggression, because you have American presence in this space that is agreed to by all sides. So there's an important security element here, aside from opening of connectivity and economic variables as well. So in that context, this is kind of what we're talking about.
What does American presence mean, Nerses?
And that is what we're discussing right now. So this is a U.S. proposal that basically says we are going to proceed in offering a solution that is acceptable to both sides. And the nuance is something that is also commensurate with Armenia's sovereignty, territorial integrity. So American presence is going to be aligned and commensurate with Armenia's laws and Armenian jurisdiction. So if that entails, for example, some mechanism of the United States leasing this territory in conjunction with the Armenian government, or the United States participating with the Armenian government in developing the roads, rail rings, and the infrastructure to make the transit route happen, right? In whatever iteration this means, fundamentally it is the United States investing both in diplomatic capital, in geopolitical power projection, and potentially economically in making this a road happen, which produces connectivity. And from Armenia's lens, the important component here is that you're having a U.S. presence, which alleviates a lot of the security concerns we have vis-a-vis Azerbaijan.
I understand that, Nerses, but either we don't know or you don't want to say. So let's U.S. presence. This does not mean U.S. customs or border guards. This does not mean the military. This does not mean...
No, there's there will not be U.S. boots on the ground. Okay.
There will be since
the best way to qualify is U.S. vested interests.
Will Armenia's border guards and customs agents be at the borders of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Nakhichevan?
So that's most definitely there will be a presence of Armenian border guards at Armenia's border. And the extent to which the inspection process would entail those configurations, this is something that is still being discussed. And this is where the whole third-party matter comes up, right? There's been much discussion about this in the last couple of days, where if a given airport, for example, all right, or border guards are basically given to contracted to private companies, those private companies follow the laws of the given country, right? And they basically do their job in inspecting or doing whatever it is that they're doing. Now, that does not mean that those independent companies or those third actors determine the law, determine the rules, and can do whatever they want. They don't exercise sovereignty. They operate on behalf of whoever it is that has hired them. So in this configuration that we're talking about, right, a third-party actor will be hired to manage, right, the technical aspects of this entire project.
Okay, including customs?
Including parts of customs. But when we talk about customs, right, what we're talking about is the Armenian laws being implemented, right, Armenian laws being enforced. Therefore, whoever the actor is that is basically implementing those laws are secondary. Because, for example, in Armenia for the longest time, when you entered Zvartnot Airport and you entered Armenia, who did the customs check? Who did the passport inspections? You had Russians doing it. But those Russians were operating under the jurisdiction of Armenian law. So we are getting stuck in the argument of, or the discussion of, the individual that is going to be performing those duties, who that individual is.
I'm gonna call you out on that. It's not about the individual. It's about who's crossing the border. In this case, Zvartnots, you have tourists, you have, people from all over the world coming and visiting
Right.
Armenia. Russian border guards, fine, they follow Armenian laws. Here, it's about Azerbaijani cargo transport.
That wasn't your question. Your question was who's going to inspect it.
No, but you brought up the Zvartnots issue, right?
Inspection mechanism.
Okay.
Inspecting. The question of who comes in.
No, but that's what, this is why
No, they can
Armenian
do, yeah,
society...
that's a different question, which is a very good question, right? So who inspects it? The inspection process, the mechanism of inspection. For example, the process might be not simply individuals, but advanced technology that is utilized, hypothetically, right, to inspect whatever it is that is coming and going. So those technical nuances are besides the point. But the fact of the matter is, whether it's an individual, whether it's a robot, whatever it is, right, it will be under the control, jurisdiction, and guidance of Armenian officers, right? Because this is sovereign Armenian territory. That's what we're talking about. Your question is, okay, you understand the inspection process, but then what will be permitted, if I understand correctly, to enter Armenia or not enter Armenia? Was that your question?
No, my question, it wasn't so much of a question as it was a statement of understanding why the Armenian public is extremely concerned about third parties controlling, overseeing, leasing, managing, whatever it is, a road connecting Azerbaijan to Azerbaijan because of our recent
But and so yet you have two issues here. One, because there isn't enough information out there, most people again fall into the trap of what I initially spoke about: speculation, conspiratorial thinking. Second, you have a very important presence here of certain anti-state actors and external proxies who are going to politicize and instill fear in people on this. But the point is very straightforward. Okay, what do Armenian laws dictate? Whether it's a third party or whatever party that we're talking about, if the consistent point being made is that this party would have to abide by and follow Armenian laws, right? And their responsibilities will be defined by Armenian law, then in that context, these concerns that you are suggesting are moot. Furthermore, if the concern is who will be entering Armenia, right, through this transit route,
because we don't even know if it's a roadway, a highway, a rail link.
The initial understanding is that it will be some kind of a rail link.
So it would be.
So it'd be trains or cargo, so on and so forth.
Would it also have passenger cargo?
Again,
we don't know this.
We don't know that. That has not been a subject of conversation.
Right.
But regardless of that point, right? If Armenian law dictates X, Y, and Z, okay, then X, Y, and Z products can only be permitted to basically be used in crossing these transit routes. If Armenian law dictates X, Y, and Z type individuals, even whatever the case might be, then that is what we're talking about. So this argument that a third party could come in, disregard Armenian law, unilaterally determine what is acceptable and not acceptable. And therefore, that is what we should be concerned about, is really disconnected with the entire proposal and the subject that we're having conversations about.
Okay, so like you noted, it has been extremely politicized and, social media filters and everywhere. But even the man on the street, the typical person on the street, would have concerns. And I would say justifiable concerns, because because of the vacuum of information, people are...
Right, due to vacuum information, it's understandable.
So what would you say to those who argue that Armenia is giving up sovereignty, Armenia is abdicating territory, Armenia has become such a weak puppet country that it can no longer control its roots, and former officials, current opposition members, they've all been using this to whip up,
right,
if you a little bit of hysterical frenzy. What about the Russian base in Gyumri? Why is that acceptable? Why was it acceptable that we had Russians protecting our borders with Iran and Turkey? What would you say to that? It's a two-pronged question.
Okay, so let me answer the first question. There is absolutely no basis for a lot of these accusations that you're seeing coming out from previous officials or whoever it is that's basically proliferating misinformation. Because when they talk about Armenia leasing land, okay, hypothetically, whatever that iteration might be, or having a third-party operator, or whatever the case might be, there is no basis for them to argue that there's this abdication of sovereignty, when all of those will be happening precisely within the context of Armenian law. Now, if there was a conversation that X, Y, and Z actors will be acting under their own discretion and outside of Armenian law, then we could talk about abdication of sovereignty, because then that is what qualifies as extraterritoriality. But there has been absolutely zero evidence of any such conversation, right, or any such speculation. So what we're seeing, these kinds of individuals, former Foreign Minister Vartan Oskanyan being one of these more prolific actors who spread misinformation on this subject, making claims that are absolutely unfounded.
Well, It doesn't help that U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, what was his name, Tom Barrack,
right,
made some crazy comments during his press conference a week ago.
And then there was, again, what
talking
we tend
about
to do...
control, tribe.
Right, absolutely. And what we tend to do is basically, this guy was talking for 53 minutes. Mm-hmm. He decided to bring an example within a 30-second context, and we take that out of the entire context and we run away with it. Mm-hmm. But be that as it may, okay? Absolutely, because the way Barrack framed it was disconnected from what the proposal is on the ground.
Yeah, he was talking about a 100-year lease.
Yeah, I am not familiar with... Sure. Centuries of leasing or what he was talking about. There's nothing in the proposal or conversations about tribalism so. I mean, again, he was engaged in sort of this manner of speaking example that he threw in there while he was talking about Turkey, Syria, so on and so forth. And we basically took that statement, right, as if it existed in a vacuum and presented as the official U.S. position. The proposal. That's not what the reality.
But of course we need to acknowledge it, because
we need to acknowledge. We need to contextualize what that entails and how it fits into the broader conversation at hand. So what we do know then, right, as more information has come out, okay, and that could be publicly discussed, is that the U.S. has made the proposal that it has
to both Armenia and
Azerbaijan, right, as a solution that could allow for normalization. All the other nuances that we've spoken about, and clearly there's nothing in there that has suggested any loss of sovereignty, or as some of the opposition figures or certain actors in diaspora who sadly are relatively clueless are talking about things such as outsourcing sovereignty, just conceptually untenable things, right? Sovereignty cannot be outsourced. Sovereignty cannot be abdicated. Because if that was the case, Azerbaijan would have had its Zangezur corridor, okay, 5 years ago. And so these arguments, right, are disconnected with what we're seeing on the ground. But to precisely kind of tie in with the second question you ask, exactly, when all of these individuals are all of a sudden so concerned about Armenia's sovereignty, when they abdicated much of Armenia's strategic infrastructure, natural resources to Russia, when there's a Russian presence in Gyumri, a military base that Armenia has no access to. Armenia cannot control what Russia brings or takes out. Armenia is not even allowed to be informed of what Russia brings into that airbase or takes out of that airbase. That is the ultimate definition of abdicating sovereignty, because on your sovereign territory, you have no control over an actor.
Well, what about U.S. bases all in Eastern Europe? Have they abdicated sovereignty to the U.S.?
So the U.S. bases in Europe or in Turkey or in Asia, those are contractually based, where the United States leases that territory and signs a contract with allied countries to have those military bases. And based on the contractual agreement that they have with the given country, of course, there's information sharing, right? Of course, the United States has with those partners, again, contracts vary based on the type of military base, so on and so forth. But I am not familiar of a situation where the United States has a military base in a given country, where that country basically has no say, involvement, or agency in how the foreign military base operates or exists in their country. Also, let's just note that while Russia is given this entire space to have their military base, Armenia also pays for the electricity, gas, and all the expenses of that military base.
Without having any access to information, knowledge.
Absolutely. So when we have these conversations about sovereignty, okay, most forget that this has been the case for 30 years. And so there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty.
Well, one might argue that, yes, you sort of gave up parts of your sovereignty to Russia as your big brother, and now that your big brother is no longer there to protect you because he's preoccupied in Ukraine, you're looking for a new big brother in the U.S.
You want to call Russia big brother or abusive stepbrother or whatever you want to call it. But basically, you're not bringing a U.S. military base here. You have zero military presence here, right? So the American presence here isn't defined by any...
But it's a pretty important strategic presence, Nerses. You have to
most
admit.
definitely, but it's not militarized. And that's why it's extraordinarily a different point. There are no boots on the ground. And so what we're then talking about are completely different dynamics. And I think it's very important that we're having this sovereignty conversation, because in the past, we never even used the term. So I'm very happy that it's part of our public discourse. But when it's manipulated and misused as an instrument against important Armenian interests, there remains the problem. So if, hypothetically, if some time passes and the proposal is released, and if there's an agreement, and in this agreement, the Armenian government, right, has basically agreed to terms that violate what we discuss and define sovereignty, then it would be correct to criticize it. Okay? But if it's not the case, then all these conversations that we're having are basically untrue. Okay, so one of the important stipulations that Azerbaijan has always made is unimpeded access. Okay, right? That basically means Azerbaijan could bring whatever it wants into Armenian territory, drive through, and get into Nakhichevan.
Or also stop halfway through and bomb whatever
and Armenians cannot touch it, cannot look at it. They have unimpeded access. That is what was envisioned, right,
in November
with
9th.
their Russian buddies in the November 9th statement. That would be an abdication of sovereignty, because a state will have no control over what enters its country and what doesn't. But this entire conversation that we've been having is fundamentally designed around alleviating and not allowing those kinds of developments. Okay? And this is why we have what we have, and this is why the terms of this proposal are specifically defined by the same things we keep talking about: jurisdiction, territorial integrity, sovereignty, so on and so forth. You have none of that when it comes to the Russian military base. Absolutely none of that. And so these sort of, the level of blindness, if you will, and a refusal to acknowledge abdication of sovereignty when it comes to the Russian military base. But all of a sudden, this proposal, where it's not militarized, we don't have boots on the ground, right? And it's designed to give Armenia a certain layer of soft deterrence, All of a sudden, sovereignty becomes a subject of conversation, and it should be. But it's not applicable because there's no evidence of sovereignty being abdicated or violated.
Russia and Iran, they're not going to be very happy with this setup.
Not true.
Why?
Russia is not going to be very happy, but I think Russia understands that they have no agency anymore in the process.
They have a Russian military base.
They have a military base which doesn't have too many soldiers. It's basically, a decaying structure, and it's open knowledge that most soldiers that serve in that military base come from affluent families that pay bribes and come and hang out in Gyumri because they don't want to go and fight in Ukraine. Be that as it may, that's a Russian issue. So in that context, qualifying that base as being anything substantive that could obstruct the normalization process, the U.S. proposal, is really not true. So Russia, while they might not be happy because they are left out of the process, and therefore they are, for example, operationalizing their local proxies to create domestic brouhaha and instability and all the things that you initially mentioned. But fundamentally, they do not have sufficient levers of influence to disrupt or stop the process.
They have economic levers that could be utilized to punish Armenia.
And they are going to utilize their economic levers not just for this, but anytime they disagree with our policies or they want to punish us.
It starts with cognac flowers, and then it could be natural gas.
Exactly. Now, if they're going to use that for this normalization process, then they will. If they're going to use it for any other policy they agree with, they will, right? So Russia does have certain levers, but those do not suffice to kill this deal, is my point. As far as Iran, we saw Iran's ambassador to Armenia give an interview yesterday, and Iran's position, interestingly, seems very closely aligned with that of official Yerevan. Iran's point is that they fully support opening of roads, of interconnectivity, as long as it is within the jurisdiction and sovereignty of Armenia. So conceptually, we have not seen anything that has come out of Iran that suggests they are opposed to this proposal, or they find it problematic.
And it's also an opportune time, if I may phrase it in this way. Both Iran and Russia are preoccupied with their own issues, domestic and foreign, which perhaps gives Armenia a window of opportunity to push this through. But the question remains, has Baku agreed, or will Baku agree, in your opinion, to this?
Well, that's the whole thing, right? At this point, if Baku had agreed, something would have been signed. So we know right now Baku has not agreed. But we also know that Baku has not categorically rejected it. So Baku, from my understanding, is still attempting to basically insert as much as they can into the U.S. proposal that could be somewhat acceptable without them having to categorically reject what would be a rejection of President Trump.
Right. So obviously Baku wouldn't want to do that, right? But they may come back with counter demands. And what kinds of scenarios could we expect from Azerbaijan's side?
There could be numerous scenarios. One, as I noted, would be their demand of an unimpeded access.
Okay, but that we know.
Or them creating certain requests that certain cargo, for example, can be inspected, but other cannot, right? So they could create nuance and those sort of specific demands that allows them to kind of manipulate the process, but still advance their interests. They could come and say, this lease process or whatever it is that Armenia and the United States are discussing, we need to be a part of it. Right? We need to be party of it. Or maybe Turkey needs to be a part of it. Or why don't we have a regional consortium or consortium that basically leases this territory and it becomes a regional corridor, a regional transit route. So they may attempt to do make proposals of that sort, which from a broader perspective might seem intuitive, but that in of itself would be a violation of Armenian sovereignty.
And absolutely problematic as soon as Turkey gets involved.
That's a red line for Armenia. Yeah. It's problematic if Turkey or Azerbaijan are involved because those categorically contradict Armenian strategic interests. Azerbaijan may utilize these kinds of requests, or they might say, you may inspect cargo, but if our citizens are passing through, you don't have the right to inspect the passport of our citizens, or I don't know, right? So they could come up with all kinds of requests, not because these are genuine, but they serve as artificial obstructions to basically prolong the process and then exhaust the negotiations.
Okay, but Nerses, we're seeing for the first time in a very long time the American administration directly involved in trying to resolve certain issues.
Right.
Not everything. Obviously, peace treaty is way off in the distance in some weird future. At what point will the U.S. administration say, if Baku continually obstructs, continue bringing demands that do not align with American strategic interests in the region, they could walk away?
Absolutely. So it's my understanding that United States, the Trump administration has demonstrated just extensively, they work with deadlines.
Pardon?
They work with deadlines. And so there is, I don't know what that deadline is. There is a deadline with respect to Baku responding, providing a final response to the U.S. proposal. And if Baku continues extending the process and not providing a concrete answer, it will come to a specific point where the United States would basically ask for a final answer. And this is where we would understand if Baku is ready to reject President Trump's proposal, or they would understand the potential detrimental side effects of that.
What could a side effect be if they refuse the proposal?
Right. So if they refuse and reject the proposal, it is my understanding, because I was in D.C. and had all these meetings with members of both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and State Department and National Security Council. So there's a fairly healthy consensus within America's decision-making and foreign policy infrastructure that if these negotiations collapse, if the U.S. proposal collapses, and if Azerbaijan is the cause of that collapse, then the United States will view Armenia as its only constructive partner in the South Caucasus and would directly work with Armenia in enhancing and deepening bilateral relations, and Azerbaijan would be sidelined with respect to American interests and projects.
What does that even entail, Nerses? So America and Armenia develop stronger ties. Does that mean defense? Does that mean security guarantee? What does that mean?
It means deepening of bilateral ties. And when we talk about bilateral relations, that includes everything from economics to defense to all the other aspects. Now, again, when we talk about security guarantees, that's a whole different trap. Armenians need to start talking about the security guarantees. We need to stop using the word guarantee, right? But if the United States right now, for example, is seeking to find a solution between two warring, conflicting parties, right, that have been in the situation for 3 decades, and from their lens, this proposal is a very fair proposal. But when one party refuses to accept that proposal, okay, that's one. Two, the United States says implementing this proposal is also in my strategic interest. And so when a party rejects it and thus violates America's strategic interest from Washington's perspective, okay, and that the United States invests so much diplomatic capital and that the president wants results, and one party does not allow that to happen by virtue of them rejecting this entire process, then the United States comes to the understanding and decision that this party and the way it behaves is fundamentally contradictory to American interests in the region, while the other party has consistently agreed, has been constructive, so on and so forth. So that is the thinking in D.C. Now, assuming Azerbaijan rejects and the United States, says if you don't want to work with us, that's fine, then we will deepen our bilateral relations with Armenia and leave you out of the process. What is important and strategically interesting about that way of thinking is that if U.S. enhances and deepens bilateral relations with Armenia while sidelining Azerbaijan, that means Armenia's capacity for development and growth, specifically in the defense and the security sector, is going to exponentially be faster.
So there would be no punitive repercussions for Azerbaijan for basically telling Trump to take a hike?
There might be some elements of sanctions possibly. But in of itself, the United States' position is that I'm not going to punish you if you don't want to work with me, but I'm going to work with the other guy, the other person, and simply make them stronger. The point that I would make is that from Aliyev's perspective, it is a bit of a nightmare for him to see an Armenia getting stronger under the support of the United States, and him being basically
We've written
isolated.
about this. You've written about
Most
this.
definitely.
Yeah. Is this a win-win for Armenia? It's a strategic maneuver, right? But is it also, could it be a slippery slope to something like a nightmare scenario?
It's too early to talk about risk propensity because, again, the nuances of the deal haven't been publicized and haven't been agreed. But if we're looking at what's been proposed, and assuming, let's say, it goes through based on the public information that we have, that a transit route under U.S. presence, let's just use that term, which, as I noted, gives Armenia a sense of soft security and deterrence and appeases whatever artificial concerns Azerbaijan has. And this opens interconnectivity. And that both parties signed this. Okay, that means you have an arrangement where Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the United States have signed to an agreement, okay, that normalizes and addresses this issue. That is a win within the domain of security risk assessment because that completely diminishes, right, the probability of Azerbaijan invading Armenia anytime soon. So in that context, that's a win.
Invading Sunik, but doesn't stop it from invading Davush, for example.
I would be nearly, and I'm not going to use the word impossible because that's not what we do, but it's highly improbable that Azerbaijan will have an economic transit route and a regional connectivity agreement with the United States and Armenia, right, under the auspices of the United States, and then invade the same country, right, that they have this agreement with. Is it out of the question? It's never out of the question with dictators.
We've seen his maximalists.
But within the domain of probability, that becomes extraordinarily difficult for Aliyev to be able to pull off, right? And so the security element of this is a win. Now, the long-term understanding of what this entails for Armenia's ability to determine economic arrangements, or Armenia's ability to determine domestic political developments. Well, that I can't say if it's a win or what that situation may be. Because the next generation, for example, okay, might have such a very different conception of developments that they might be of the opinion we don't want a third party, for example, controlling this transit route. And assuming there's a certain lease agreement, that if that lease agreement ends, the new generation of political leaders in Armenia make the argument that we no longer want to renew that lease because we have the capacity of managing things as we need to. Would that produce issues down the line? What may those issues be? So on and so forth. So observing things, 30, 40 years from now, right? Well, those are some of the concerns that could come up. So qualifying this purely as a win-win would be intellectually dishonest. But within the domain of security, when observing the level of power disparity between the countries, when understanding the asymmetry, and understanding the fact that Azerbaijan is itching for a reason to attack, that the entirety of Aliyev's thinking is defined by obstructing the peace process and having more instability and disrupting Armenia's ability to rebuild. And considering all of that and realizing that this agreement, right, would, within the domain of security, contain Azerbaijan for X number of years, this is not something that can be taken lightly and not be viewed within the domain of security as some form of a win.
I found it rather telling that the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, regardless of how he phrased what he phrased, would bring this up, and this would open up the conversation the way it has. What is Turkey's position? Do we know? Have they publicly said anything, or through back channels? Are they supporting this?
I am not certain at this point what Turkey's position is, but I could understand Turkey would be more supportive of what Azerbaijan is suggesting, and it would be in Turkey's interest to have some vested presence in this project.
What does that mean, vested presence?
Whether they are a party to the construction of certain projects, whether they are part of this so-called possible consortium that Azerbaijan envisions with Turkey being involved. So Turkey would like to have more direct involvement.
Although that might be unacceptable.
It is categorically
really
unacceptable for
okay,
us.
So
but to answer your question,
right.
What might some of Turkey's perspectives or demands be? It would be within that domain. But I think we're concentrating a little too much on what America's ambassador to Turkey said, in a 30, 40-second example, but then ignoring the fact that President Trump, right, at a press conference with the Secretary General of NATO categorically make the point that from his perspective, a deal is very close and it needs to happen. My understanding is that the administration is directly signaling to Baku
Well, because
that
Rubio
you have
also,
to get in line.
right, Rubio also said it during a cabinet meeting, didn't he, a week before that?
Absolutely. So we are seeing at the highest levels
Right.
in the United States making a direct point that we expect something to be finalized. Now, who is slowing down that expectation? It's not Armenia, I can tell you that much, okay? So I think understanding that process, those expectations, is more consistent in being able of allowing us to better conceptualize what the state of play is, as opposed to concentrating on a 30-second soundbite from the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, who in essence is not a high-ranking official within the State Department or the administration.
Well, Nerses, thank you for elucidating and trying to shed more light on this whole process. And I know there's a lot of information that we don't have at the moment. So again, sometimes I feel like everything, we're trying to, find things in the dark, trying to make sense of it. And that's what leads to such, I would say, unadulterated hysteria that we're seeing, especially on social media. So I think this conversation was really important to help all of us understand, because our default position is always to be emotional. and not look at things in a rational way.
When emotions are fused with cynicism,
Yeah,
that creates
and
a recipe.
politicization, of course.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
but
right.
understanding the facts on the ground, refraining from speculation. It's always important to critically question, challenge. I'm not saying that based on the information out there, everybody should accept and run away with this deal. But we should also be healthy enough in our discourse to basically wait for more details to come out before finalizing opinions, and then based on half or incomplete information, engaging in this conspiratorial thinking. So in that context, just to kind of wrap it up, we know that the United States is deeply invested in finding a solution to this problem. Okay, and it is the only actor that is doing it. We know that the U.S. proposal has a lot of economic interests, infrastructure interests that are consistent with also the interest of Armenia. And we know that this proposal also offers Armenia a very important layer of security. So, understanding all that, which are the more dominant factors, we can then proceed to litigating and addressing the other variables. But the macro issues that are so fundamental to Armenia's security, I think those should not be ignored, and for us to have petty conversations on specific matters over which most don't even have the facts on, because those haven't been agreed on by either side.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Thank you so much, as always, Nerses.
My pleasure.